Can anyone hear me? Is that good? Okay, I was told to check the mic. I'd like to begin by thanking Amandio and Inês for organizing this conference and to thank the scientific committee for putting this together as well. I'd also like to start with a word of warning. I am a bit under the weather. I have a bit of a cold, so if I sniffle a bit or if I don't sound as clear as I would like to, I apologize in advance. That said, I'd like to begin. Many readers view Jane Austen's social values as conservative. After all, marriage seems inevitable for female characters in her works. Truthfully, marriage confirms and reproduces established social arrangements, and as we know, in the 19th century, this was seen as one of the best possible social arrangements, especially for women, who were told to marry as soon as possible if they wanted to live a comfortable life. Put simply, marriage was crucial to a woman's survival. This was especially true for a woman of inferior social rank. It is interesting, then, that in Austen's Northanger Abbey, the character Henry Tilney should state, "Man has the power of choice, woman only the advantage of refusal." This is surprising because Austen shows that refusal is in itself a choice. Austen creates three heroines, Elizabeth Bennet, Fanny Price, and Emma Woodhouse, who choose to reject proposals of marriage, even though it's not in their best interest based on their social class. Why? Why are certain characters accepted as partners in marriage, while others are rejected? What matters in a proposal? I will answer these questions through an examination of Pride and Prejudice's Elizabeth Bennet and Mansfield Park's Fanny Price, both heroines who reject proposals of marriage. All of Austen's novels end in marriage and thus seem to point to conservative values as ideal, with a fact that has made her work vulnerable to feminist critique. But Austen restricts her conservative adherence to marriage, especially in Pride and Prejudice, even though she does celebrate marital felicity as an ideal. Contrary to critique, however, this ideal is not based on societal values, but on those of the heroine. Elizabeth Bennet, for instance, is concerned with one thing: her happiness. And her quest for happiness leads her to reject not one, but two marriage proposals. As we will see, she rejects these suitors because they respect society's needs more than Elizabeth's needs. And what is Austen doing here, if not realigning marriage with the values of woman who has little autonomy otherwise? I would like to begin by analyzing the first of Elizabeth's suitors, Mr. Collins. To Collins, only one person is worthy of deference, and that person is Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Lady Catherine is significant. As several critics have noted, she is a reflection of stringent codes of moral, gendered, and sexual conduct. Therefore, Collins's deference to Lady Catherine shows his respect for the rules established by society, and these rules dictate that he should want and need a wife. Who that wife is, however, doesn't matter, and it shows in his proposal. Though Collins warns that he may be, quote, run away with by his feelings, unquote, his proposal is monotonous, rehearsed, and worst of all, attentive to no one's happiness but his own. Elizabeth rejects him then, not just because of his follies or moral shortcomings, of which there are a lot, but because he is, as Morris states, quote, the smug enemy of romance, unquote. His proposal lacks substance, attentiveness, and respect, and through this, Austen assures Elizabeth's right to reject him. At the moment of refusal, Elizabeth states, quote, you could not make me happy, and I am convinced that I am the last woman in the world who could make you so. Here, Austen prioritizes Elizabeth's happiness where Collins does not. Although society does not give Elizabeth the power of choice, Austen still gives her heroine autonomy. And it is this autonomy that allows Elizabeth to continuously question imposed social positions, as well as imposed social conventions. The same occurs in her rejection of the very eligible Mr. Darcy. There is little to distinguish the two men. Darcy's proposal is just as sudden, his avowal just as unexpected, and his certainty of her acceptance just as disquieting to the heroine. Thus, Elizabeth refuses him on two counts. The first, his desire of offending and insulting her and her family, and the second, his, quote, means of ruining, perhaps forever, the happiness of a most beloved sister, unquote. Indeed, Darcy's central fault is to have been careless about pleasing other people, to have had what Elizabeth stingingly terms, quote, a selfish disdain of the feelings of others. Like Collins, Darcy's inability to consider others' happiness, and in this case, that of Elizabeth and of her sister Jane, ensures his rejection the first time around. And I would like to emphasize the use of the word first here, because Darcy eventually re-proposes to Elizabeth, but only once he has learned to think of her happiness as his own. Unlike with Collins, Elizabeth's rejection helps Darcy realize his shortcomings and admit that his pretensions were, quote, insufficient to please a woman worthy of being pleased, unquote. For Darcy, change arises from this first rejection. Darcy is not the only one who has to change, however. Elizabeth must too let go of her judgments of others. Through such transformations, Austen suggests that the pursuit of happiness in marriage has to work both ways. Both individuals must change and grow together and consolidate their views of society and what marriage is supposed to be. This analysis is supported by Bromberg, who argues that the heroine's choice of suitor coincides with her own process of self-realization. Indeed, the ideal Austen marriage must be the, quote, culmination of a process of education about the self, the other, and the world, unquote. This process is definitely found in Elizabeth and Darcy. By the time they get engaged, he has checked his pride, and she has let go of her prejudice. What's more, Elizabeth has learned that the interests of the ruling classes are not morally binding. When Lady Catherine comes to quench the passion between Darcy and Elizabeth, Elizabeth's response is that she is, quote, resolved to act in that manner which will constitute her happiness, without reference to Lady Catherine or to any person so wholly unconnected to her, unquote. Elizabeth recognizes that the call for propriety does not matter, and that the mere stateliness of money and rank will not awe her, and indeed do not need to awe her. Therefore, the pursuit of happiness invites a degree of autonomy to the female heroine in Austen's novels, and this is something most readers are remiss in ignoring. Because of this, Pride and Prejudice becomes a work of female wish fulfillment, precisely because Elizabeth's refusal allows her to put the marriage structure to the test, and her acceptance enables her to rework this social strata without compromising her values. If we continue to look at which proposals are rejected, we see how Austen is employing a conservative social more, marriage, in order to rework and repossess social structures from within. This intrinsic reworking allows Austen to settle potentially competing claims without conflict or sacrifice, and this formula is put to use once more in Mansfield Park. Like Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park tests the boundaries of the common gentry family. There is a crucial difference, however. If in Pride and Prejudice, Austen shows herself willing to transform her heroine and the way her heroine navigates stringent society, in Mansfield Park, she exposes the hollowness of social pretensions through a heroine staunch in her moral and religious values. So here, there's not so much more of a transformation, but an acceptance of the values that the heroine already has. Similarly to Elizabeth, who dislikes Collins and Darcy for their disregard of others, Fanny Price dislikes her suitor, Henry Crawford, because he thinks only of himself. Unlike the suitors in Pride and Prejudice, however, his lack of consideration for others' happiness is not based on an unawareness of others' needs, but on an egotistical drive to ignore them. Henry is completely self-interested. For instance, he follows the rules of courtship with Maria, even though he knows she is engaged. Henry only follows these rules because he knows he will never carry out the courtship to its full potential. The transgression is clear here, and Austen highlights the superficiality of such stringent codes of conduct. And it is Fanny's deviation from these codes that endears her to Henry, who is used to having women fall in line with his courtship. Truly, Fanny's lack of interest in him is what inspires Henry's interest in her. Because Henry knows that he has no other feelings or actions to recommend him otherwise, he proposes to Fanny when he knows she won't reject him, immediately following the revelation that he has sponsored her brother's lieutenancy, a great act of kindness toward the one she loves the most. Henry's supposed concern is subverted by his acting in the way that most benefits him. Rather than giving Fanny great relief and joy, as we see in the quote I've put above, Henry's proposal causes her great distress because she realizes she should accept him, though he is unequal to her in morals. Henry is therefore mostly aligned with Mr. Collins from the onset of his proposal. The heroines dislike these men and know they would never marry them before they even propose. But in Fanny's case, as much as in Elizabeth's, the rejection of this particular suitor directly hinders social and economic standing. Their rejections therefore highlight how Austen privileges moral values and female independence over 19th-century paradigms. And if Lady Catherine de Bourgh represents these paradigms in Pride and Prejudice, Sir Thomas is the allegory of choice in Mansfield Park. Indeed, and as Johnson assures us, the orderliness of the world cherished by Sir Thomas is closely linked to the imperative of female propriety. So it is no surprise that, to Sir Thomas, Fanny's refusal of Henry is preposterous. Henry's proposal should not be refused because it advances Fanny's social status in a way that had until then been impossible. Like Elizabeth, Fanny is a poor young lady with no prospects and may never receive a second proposal. Both are aware of the ramifications of rejection, and both know their means of survival are dependent on their eventually getting married. By allowing Fanny to stand up to Sir Thomas and assert that she cannot, quote, like Henry well enough to marry him, unquote, because she truly loves Edmund, the author subverts the traditional order of marriage. Fanny Price's happiness and her moral values are more important than economic security and societal status. By incorporating the marriage plot and allowing her heroines to challenge it through rejection, Austen demonstrates how the act of marriage is not a natural, but rather a historical, societal, and religious construct, but one that is not always imbued with moral values. And these values abound in Mansfield Park, where Fanny's, quote, dependence on her faith and integrity, unquote, reveal her to be, quote, well-principled and religious. And these are the qualities that center most in her interactions with Henry and Edmund. Although religion is not a theme unique to Mansfield Park, critics like Marilyn Butler have detected Austen's religiosity, especially in this novel, where, quote, the action is so entirely bound up with the value systems of the various characters that they are always acting out their beliefs, unquote. Fanny's rejection of Henry Crawford, then, is an acting out of her religious morals. And though Henry tries to align himself with Fanny's religiosity, Fanny does not accept him as her husband because he is not inherently a good person. And this is crucial. An inherent moral goodness is necessary to Fanny in marriage, and such virtue is the one thing Henry lacks. Sinful transgression keep Henry and Fanny apart, for his lack of moral values make him unworthy of the heroine. And it is so particularly in comparison to Edmund, an ordained clergyman whose values aligned with the heroine's. Edmund's chosen profession, along with his consistent kindness toward the heroine, prove that he has inherent goodness within him. Although, considering wealth and status, Henry would have been a more reasonable and perhaps even more societally accepted choice, Fanny's steadfast love for Edmund demonstrates that she values goodness over material advantage in marriage. As Ruth Perry remarks, paternal first cousin marriages in Austen's time were marked by material advantage because they consolidated property and wealth within the family unit. Conversely, maternal first cousin marriages, which is the case with Fanny and Edmund, had, quote, all the coziness and family feeling of endogamous marriage, but without the added benefit of safeguarding property and wealth. So, when Fanny marries Edmund, nothing material can be achieved from the match. As we have seen, however, Fanny's reasons for loving Edmund are not founded on material wealth. She loves him because he gives her some, quote, proof of affection. To allow Fanny to marry Henry would be to buttress social conventions of the time, whereas Edmund and Fanny's betrothal simply announces the mutual consent of their hearts. This is why Henry Crawford fails. His proposal is too imbued with the social investment latent in their union. While there is no wealth to be obtained from Fanny and Edmund's match, there is one thing: comfort. And the word is repeated 5 times in the final chapter of the novel alone. Comfort, not excitement, wealth, or power, is what Fanny and Edmund obtained from their union. To Fanny, the affection and comfort of their household is as, quote, secure as earthly happiness can be. And though their marriage lacks the passion found in Elizabeth and Darcy's union, what matters most to Fanny is the goodness of one's moral compass and the comfort that arises from knowing that one's consciousness has gone uncompromised. I would like to end with the following idea. If in Pride and Prejudice, Austen uses the rejected marriage proposal to assert a woman's right to happiness, in Mansfield Park, she adds a woman's right to choose based on the suitor's moral virtues. As a result, the rejection of marriage proposals in these novels speaks to larger issues of happiness, morality, and autonomy for women in the 19th century. Austen thus pioneers the idea that the novel's heroine must recognize and elect the right suitor, even when faced with other, and perhaps even more appealing, alternatives. While Austen was certainly concerned with Elizabeth Bennet's happiness and Fanny Price's comfort, she thus also centered the distinctive social ramifications involved in the rejection of male suitors. In this way, Austen's novels show women how to seek independence and happiness, while also admonishing against blind acceptance of the social conventions of the upper class. In subverting the order of a marriage by obligation, the author offers her heroine the possibility of choice, and of a love, allied in both its intelligence and in its subversion of the social script. Thank you.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to present my research. Thank you for organizing this conference, Amandio and Inês. So after marriage proposals and weddings, I will talk about adultery. And I will actually talk about adultery in combination with another common theme in 19th century European literature, which is music. And actually, adultery and music are even seen as stereotypes in the 19th century. And what I would like to show today is that these themes inform us on the concept of family, but also how they intrinsically construct and deconstruct the idea of family within the narration. And for this, I have chosen two novels belonging to the tradition of the novel of adultery that flourished in the second half of the century, but that are much less known than the traditional ones. So I chose the French novel Georges Sand's Le Dernier Amour, that we can translate by The Last Love, published in 1868, and Theodor Fontane's L'Adultera, published in 1882. Georges Sand's novel was actually dedicated to Flaubert, and it seems that she is trying to give her own response to the woman in adultery, so her own response to Madame Bovary. So although these two novels follow the traditional plot, so mostly set by Madame Bovary, where we have a young wife bored in her life and committing adultery, the novels I'm analyzing today reconsider the ideas of marriage and family by presenting the husband and the institution of marriage as guilty, if not more, as the adulterous wife. Although the adulterous wife Félicie in The Last Love does kill herself, as does Madame Bovary, Anna Karenina as well, or the tradition of Ephébriste, the fault is clearly drawn towards the men around her. In L'Adultera, the adulterous wife, Mélanie, does not kill herself, and she seems to live happily at the end with her lover. However, she is rejected by her first husband and her children. The theme of adultery represents a form of instability of the smallest social entity, the family, but more generally, the instability of a patriarchal society. The use of music in the texts reinforces the role of adultery by highlighting gender role and systemic constraints in 19th century Europe. So I will show how the combination of music and adultery sets up an ideal family at the beginning of each novel to then better undermine this ideal. So my presentation will start on a sort of micro level with the politics of the family, of the domestic family, to move towards the politics of gender, and finish on a more micro level with the politics of nations. By pointing at the instability of the family, music and adultery also reflect social tensions and the instability of modern Europe. I will not summarize the two novels I'm talking about because each title, The Last Love, L'Adultera, are quite self-explanatory. But I would like to focus rather on the structural aspect. Both novels show an ideal type of family in the first part, and then they deconstruct this idea in the second part. The concept of family is a driving force actually in the plot, from beginning to end. And just to have an idea, the word family appears more than 40 times in The Last Love, and although only 5 times in L'Adultera, we do have a lot of mentioning mother, father. So it is quite an important theme throughout the novels. In L'Adultera, the ideal family is embodied by Melanie, married to the businessman Van der Straten, and their 2 daughters. In The Last Love, the ideal family is a bit less traditional, as the main character, Félicie, she had a child who died. She marries an older man. She lives with her brother and her cousin that she considers as her adoptive son. The domestic values presented in these families are education, patriarchal authority, and religion. So those are the values that we have at the beginning, the family values that will be then deconstructed by adultery. Women are first presented as educators, and particularly through music. In the 19th century, it was seen as a requirement for women of middle and upper classes to learn music and to teach music to their children. So Félicie, in The Last Love, she teaches the violin to her cousin that she sees as her adoptive son. And Mélanie, in L'Adultera, she teaches the piano and singing to her daughters. The patriarchal authority is seen through the older husbands. Both women marry men who are 30 years older than them. This patriarchal authority is moral in The Last Love and a more financial or economic one in L'Adultera. And the last ideal domestic value I want to highlight is the religious one. Religious is significant in both families, and at first shows a divine-like family with the father as a godlike figure and the mother as an angel. But religion also shows the demise of such values. And a striking example is the biblical reference, "He that is without sin among us, let him first cast a stone at her." And we have this quote appearing in both novels, actually. This quote refers to an adulterous woman that Jesus defends in the New Testament. So we can see that we have religion that is at the beginning as a sort of ideal domestic value that is then deconstructed because it is linked to adultery and to the breaking of this ideal family. The adulterous act occurs in the second half of both texts, undermining what I presented, this ideal family. And it undermines them even more that it uses these exact values, it relies on them. In The Last Love, Félicie has an affair with her cousin that she raised as her son, which brings an incestuous aspect to adultery and obviously breaks the ideal family first presented. Similarly, Mélanie in L'Adultera leaves her family and she refuses to see her daughters and to say goodbye to her daughters when she leaves. Both women choose a lover who is younger than them, thus reversing this patriarchal order of the family where they married older men. And more significantly, the music played to educate their children at the beginning turns out to be an opportunity to commit adultery. That's something that we also have in Madame Bovary, who plays the piano and kind of uses her piano lessons to escape her house. She doesn't really go to piano lessons, she just wants to go to see her lover, but it's interesting to see that it's music that is used in this context. In The Last Love, the husband, Sylvestre, says to himself, and here you have the original quote in French and the translation, Félicie and Tonino, so Tonino is this cousin who becomes the lover, were playing music in the room above mine. So it's the husband speaking. I could only hear some fragments of it, as if a door was suddenly opening and brutally closing between them and me, but this door only existed in my mind. In L'Adultera, Melanie also uses music to meet her lover, and it's also through music that she meets for the first time her lover. In L'Adultera, when Melanie meets him, music is played on the piano, and it's Wotan's Farewell, which is the third act of Wagner's The Valkyrie. It's interesting because in this opera, Wotan is a god and the father of Brünnhilde, and Brünnhilde, that we can see depicted here both on the painting, she hides her siblings' incestuous relationship. So here again we have a paternal figure and we have an incestuous relationship, as we have in Georges Sand's novel. Furthermore, in L'Adultera, Melanie gets close to her lover while singing with him on a boat. So music allows us to see not only the desire for adultery, but also the deconstruction, denial of all family values presented at first in both novels. Adultery and music are common 19th century literary topics that participate in the representation of fixed gender roles. Women are usually depicted as playing the piano in the domestic sphere. In the 19th century, the piano really developed within the domestic sphere, especially in bourgeois houses, where each bourgeois house had to have a piano, and it was mostly the woman playing the piano. Yet here in the two novels that I use today, it's a bit different. It's not really the piano that we have so much, but in The Last Love, Félicie is actually a violinist, which is quite rare in literature to see a female playing the violin. And Melanie, she sings, but she sings Wagner, which is quite an unusual choice. She doesn't only sing Lieder by Schubert, for example. It is the music of Wagner, which had in the 19th century some connotations of sensuality, of desire, and also of danger and violence. So even though they play music, they are depicted as playing a different kind of music. The two adulterous characters thus subvert the traditional assigned gender roles. The instruments they play also offer a different image of their bodies. They are not hiding behind the piano, but standing, playing either the violin or singing Wagner, which shows a form somehow of empowerment. These postures are also linked to the expression and affirmation of their sexual desires. Félicie expresses her sexual frustration by playing the violin frenetically and even breaking the instrument. Her husband even sees vibration in her, just like the vibrations of her violin. Quote, "She had within her some broken or distended strings. The instrument, wonderful in itself, could not be harmonious. The harrowing sound was painful to me. However, sometimes a beautiful pure note created a delicious impression." Unquote. The traditional representation of the female body is subverted, and everything in the 19th century was pathologized. Some diseases were particularly labeled as feminine, so it's interesting to have a look at the female body, see how it was represented both in literature and in the medical discourse as well. So one of the feminine diseases, so to speak, was what was referred to as nervous illness. And that is also what Madame Bovary suffers from. So everything that was linked to nerves was also linked for women with sexuality. And that's one of the paradoxes of the 19th century, where women had to play music, but at the same time they couldn't play too much, because if they played too much it could have an effect on their nerves, and it could become a danger. It could trigger a dangerous sexuality. So we have a paradox with music where they had to play, but they had to remain moderate in their practice. Sorry. As Michel Foucault explains when he writes the history of 19th century sexuality, quote, "There was scarcely a malady or physical disturbance to which the 19th century did not impute at least some degree of sexual etiology," unquote. So Félicie suffers, as Madame Bovary, from this nervous illness, or at least that is what the doctor and her husband say she suffers from. And they refer to her pulse, her nerves, her fever. But this is exactly what George Sand denounces in her novel. In fact, she makes a satire of the male medical discourse on women when the doctor tells her husband, "Be your wife's physician." So music is a way to express female sexuality, but also to resist male control and male discourse on their bodies. Both novels actually question the role of male in the female adultery. The wife who cheats is traditionally perceived as the family breaker, as is the case for Madame Bovary, Anna Karenina, Effie Briest, and the husband is supposedly the stable pillar of the family. But here in the two novels I'm talking about, husbands, lovers, and doctors can also be seen as family breakers. According to Foucault, sex is a question of truth, and therefore of judgment, crime, and punishment. Both novels open on this question of judgment. How do we judge and punish the adulterous woman? In The Last Love, this question appears in the framing narrative. And in L'Adultera, it is introduced also at the very beginning of the novel through this painting by Tintoretto, where the adulterous woman is judged in front of the Christ. So the two novels show that the woman is not the only guilty part. They start by showing this judgment at the beginning to then show that they are not the only ones who are guilty. In each novel, the husband is appearing as an authoritative figure, controlling and confining his wife in the house. Félicie becomes ill because her husband does not let her out to see her lover. Melanie feels free when she is away from her husband. So the role of the husband is questioned in both novels. And in L'Adultera, for example, we have this quote, "A husband must not simply be good, a husband must understand his wife." And at the end of both novels, we reach the same conclusion, that it's after all also the husband's fault and also the other men around these two adulterous women that are involved. In The Last Love, a neighbor tells Félicie's husband, "You are as much guilty. You should have become your wife's lover again." So although both heroines are punished to some extent because Félicie does kill herself and Melanie is rejected by her children, they also incriminate their husbands and lover. They both give their arguments during the confrontation scene with the husband. They also have a voice raised in the novels. So George Sand and Theodor Fontane use traditional gender roles and subvert them at the same time. By doing so, they do not denounce marriage as such, or they do not denounce the entity of the family, but they do denounce the politics of power within the family and the abuse of power in marriage. And I will finish by extending this breaking of the family to show that it also shows some national, international tensions in both novels. The gender tensions that I just mentioned expressed through adultery and music, not only reflect social constraints but also national constraints. The families presented in both novels are indeed international. It's interesting to see that both adulterous women are foreigners. Félicie is Italian and her husband is French. Mélanie is Swiss and her husband is German. So women not only embody the figure of the adulterer, they also are the foreign element of the family. As the adultery has financial consequences on the family, we can relate it to broader economic considerations present in the novel. Félicie's husband does not inherit anything after her death. All her wealth, interestingly, goes to her lover. And Mélanie becomes a music teacher after her lover's bankrupt. So there is a parallel between adultery and the decline of bourgeois values in the text, reflecting changes in society at the end of the 19th century, and particularly the tension between tradition and modernity. Furthermore, L'Adultera includes discussions on the Franco-Prussian War and relations between England and Germany that seem to contrast with, here again, the use of music. It is mostly German music that we have in the text. I mentioned Wagner. We also have Schumann, Mendelssohn that are mentioned. So tensions within the family reflect discussions about tensions in Europe. And we can see the deconstruction of the family through adultery as the construction of a modern family model at the turn of the century. And I will stop here. Thank you.
In arriviste career. Alors, in here you can see all the novels I will talk about with the original title, the English translation, if needed, the date of publications, and the name of the arriviste character. So, the arriviste is an emblematic figure in the 19th century novels because it concerns a new type of man who did not exist in Europe before the French Revolution. It made fall down the estate of Rome, but was not enough. The real change could take place only with the support of the Industrial Revolution, which assured the financial ascent, and the Napoleonian epopee, which enabled the new generation to dream. These three historical events contributed to the creation of the new character who interested many of the 19th century writers. The arriviste is presented mostly as a young, handsome man of modest condition who aspires to join the high society of his country. The way up is still difficult and dangerous, but for the first time he can succeed, that is, to be accepted between the aristocrats. To achieve his aim, he needs to act cynically and to care for nobody other than himself. Although an arriviste is not a revolutionary man, he only wants to slip into the higher class and tries to convince the nobility that he was always there. That is why he cannot omit the question of the family, who is crucial in the 19th century society. Its importance is double. First, the familial origins can justify the ambition of belonging to the nobility. Second, the construction of the new family through the marriage validates the social position. The changes in the social life caused by the historical events progressed systematically but slowly across the Europe. Until 1870s, the importance of the nobility was still considerable in the high society. A young man who wanted to be fully accepted between them, and not only to be tolerated, as the parvenus were, needed to have a noble lineage. The most famous example of the successful rising from this period is Balzac's character, Eugène de Rastignac, that we see in Le Père Goriot, 1834-1835. The plot follows his career and is based on this double importance of the family, which is the filiation and the marriage. From the first sentence that introduces him to the story, Rastignac is presented not as an individual character on his own, but as a member of the family, I quote, who pinched and starved themselves to spare 1,200 francs a year for him. What is more, not only is he the part of the family, but also he completely accepts the role he is to play. He is aware of the hopes all the relatives laid on him as the eldest son and brother. His desire to make a career is a result of his ambitious character, as well as the expression of the responsibility of his siblings. Of course, he cannot be presented as a moral man who acts only because of his family, but even with his growing fascination of Parisian luxury life, he still meditates on how to, I quote, find 200,000 francs apiece for his sisters' dowries. Besides the responsibilities of which Rastignac is particularly conscious, his aristocratic family gives him some means to achieve what he is dreaming of. He is the son of the poor baron, but baron after all. He is not rich, but possesses something more important than money in this epoch of French Restoration: the name. This is the first step to be accepted in the noble society. We can understand its value even better in the scene at the opera with another of Balzac's arrivistes, Lucien from Illusion Perdue, 1837 and 1843. He comes to Paris with his mistress, Madame de Bargeton, who uses his maternal name to present him, de Rubempré. Her cousin, Marquise d'Espard, invites both of them to her box at the opera. But when she finds out that the real name of Lucien's is Chardon, and that his father was an apothecary, she abandons him immediately to avoid jokes. Eugène is far more fortunate because he is not in obligation to prove his origins. He is of noble name, therefore his aim is to make it important. The noble heritage that contributed to Rastignac's success includes also blood relationships. When the decision of his moving to Paris is taken, Eugène's aunt, Madame de Rastignac, scrutinizes their family trees to search for somebody to contact in the capital. She knows the Parisian life and understands that to achieve something, one needs to not be left alone. She chooses to contact one of the cousins, the Vicomtesse de Beauséant, who is, I quote, one of the queens of fashion at that time. The latter accepts this connection and invites young Rastignac to her ball. This invitation becomes a real beginning for Eugène's existence, both in his social life and in the construction of the plot. At this moment, the narrator stops his summary of Rastignac's early life and shows us the actions and the words of the character. The novel develops this particular formation of Rastignac, which progressively will teach him how to use his privileged position. Being a simple guest of Madame de Beauséant was already, I quote, like a patent of nobility. All the people to whom he was presented became his acquaintances, and he was allowed to pay them a visit in return. But being a cousin of Madame de Beauséant gave Rastignac other opportunities, not only the possibility to build an aristocratic network, but also social recognition. To belong to this prestigious family aroused the interest in him and became a passport that opened other Parisian doors. During the presentation at Madame de Restaud's house, one phrase which mentions the connection with Madame de Beauséant produces a magical effect and changes the attitude towards Rastignac of both Madame de Restaud's husband and lover. Once aware of this power, Rastignac will use it to conquer Delphine de Nucingen, who, I quote, would lap up all the mud that lies between the Rue Saint-Lazare and the Rue de Grenelle to gain admittance to Madame de Beauséant's salon. These are the words of Madame de Beauséant herself, because another advantage for Rastignac, she becomes his teacher of the Parisian lifestyle. To repeat it once again, the birth family gives to Rastignac strong cards to play in his rising. A name, the best Parisian relations, a social recognition and an interest in him, and information on how to take benefits of this situation. Nevertheless, this chance he has to construct a perfect career is rare, and it does not depend on character's will. This heritage is innate, and the only solution for those who are less fortunate is to cheat on their origins. Gabriel Lambert, the eponymous hero of Alexander Dumas' novel 1843, Henri Mauperin from the Goncourt brothers' novel René Mauperin 1864, and Bolesław Tańczyński from Ładny Chłopiec of Józef Ignacy Kraszewski 1879, all changed their names for more noble ones, so to find a more aristocratic spouse than themselves. Although it seems to work at the beginning, neither of the three marriages is concluded, and the heroes are punished by death, prison, or depression and alcoholism. To use the usurped name, the arrivistes need to be powerful as Bellamy de Maupassant, 1885, or to have the chance to be believed and never verified, as it is the case of Gustav Dębowski from Na paryskim bruku, 1873, of Władysław Sabowski. From the 1860s, the European literature remarks the change in the society. Money becomes more and more important and gives power to the new millionaires, reducing at the same time the influence of the aristocracy. The newcomers' wealth is sufficiently important not to preoccupy themselves about the noble name. In France, the power is much in the media, so the owners of the journals becomes not only rich, but respected, as Mr. Walter from Bellamy. With the constructing empire of journals, we can see that the new environment for the arrivists is no more the salon, but the press office. Family is not important anymore when introducing somebody to the journal. Its place is taken by the relationships. The heroes from the two books of the same name, L'Arriviste, one of Alcantara de Bram, the inventor of the word arriviste, and the other of Marc Stéphane, are literary men who earn money with their pen. They are not of a noble name. They can succeed because they know the right persons. In Poland, at the end of the century, the attention is at Łódź, named Polish Manchester, the heaven of textile industry. People become millionaires in several months, not only the Poles, but also the Germans and the Jews. The family bonds are not a condition to join the financial aristocracy. Everybody comes to Łódź to get rich, and the parvenus are more frequent than the arrivistes. But even then, the noble name still attracts the parvenus because of its symbolical meaning. Bombasztajn, a businessman from Ładny Chłopiec, employs as his partner a nobleman, Bolesław Tańczyński, who presents himself as member of famous noble family of Tańczyński. Bombasztajn knows that this attribution of the name is false, but he does not mind it. On the contrary, he tells everyone, I quote, who and what he is. The secret has its charm. People are stupid. But the business where there is a count incognito, and Bombasztajn is apparently only a partner, arouse curiosity. Selling the shares would be a piece of cake. Moritz in Raymond's Ziemia Obiecana, 1899, claims that the fact of living in the same apartment with his noble friend, Karol Borowiecki, adds 20,000 rubles to his credit. The aristocratic name is still an added value because it awakes people trust and respect. It refers to all the values of non-capitalist world. Even Bellamy follows the temptation to change his name for Du Roi des Contelles, if it is only to satisfy his and his wife's vanity. As we said at the beginning, the question of marriage is subsequent to the one of the origins. The reason of this could be found in the construction of the society from the 19th century, which is based on the married couples. Even if the adultery is accepted, there exists a fidelity to marriage as a social institution. Eugène de Rastignac follows his cousin's advice and becomes lover of Delphine de Nucingen. What is important, though, is that his motivation is her being Mr. de Nucingen's wife, and for Rastignac's sake, she should never change it. If an arriviste takes a mistress, it is not for fly with her and to be put outside the society, as did Madame de Beauséant and Gaston de Ney during their 9 idyllic years in Switzerland in Balzac's La Femme Abandonnée. On the contrary, as he wants to be a part of society, his mistress should help him to establish himself and to get rich. They can be in love, but the separation from the husband is out of question, because only wealthy people can afford that. Having a mistress was an obvious thing for the young arrivistes, but they were aware that one day they have to get married. It is the easiest way to succeed in life, as Henri Montperrin explains to his mother. I quote, "The most difficult thing to get in this world, the thing we pay the most dearly for, snatch from each other, fight for, the thing we only obtain by force of genius or by luck, by meanness, privations, by wild efforts, perseverance, resolution, energy, audacity of our work, is money, isn't that so? Now money means happiness and the honor of being rich. It means enjoyment, and it brings with it the respect and esteem of the million. Well, I have discovered that there is a way of getting in straightforwardly and promptly, without any fatigue, without difficulty, and without genius, quite simply, naturally, quickly, and honorably. And this way is by marriage. Another thing I discovered is that there is no need to be remarkably handsome nor astonishingly intelligent in order to make a rich marriage. The only thing necessary is to will it coolly, calmly, and with all one's force of willpower, to stake all one's chances on that card. In fact, to look upon getting married as one's object in life, one's future career. The society determines the arriviste to construct a new family, as well as the choice of the bride is conditioned by social connections. Henri Montperrin chooses to marry the daughter of his mistress, as Rastignac did and Bellamy will do. For Rastignac, it is, according to Félicien Marceau, a compensation for a faithful gigolo, whereas Montperrin and Duroy try to conclude their marriage against their mistress's will. What counts is what could be obtained by a good marriage. The first thing is money, of course. The arriviste should search for a maiden with a big dowry. Henri Montperrin is to get 40,000 pounds of dowry and the heritage after Mr. and Mrs. Bourgeois' death. Rastignac marries the only child of the Nucingen, and Duroy, the only child of Monsieur Walter. So the two of them can also count on an important heritage from their parents-in-law. Furthermore, by getting married, the young man joins a new family network, which is as strong as the one of his birth family. Being a son-in-law of an important man influences the future career. Rastignac will be 2 times a member of the government and will collect a fortune of his own. Duroy will walk out of the church with his bride, looking towards the National Assembly. Borowiecki will become a director of one of the biggest factories in Łódź. Gabriel Lambert and Maszko from Rodzina Połanieckich, 1894, of Henryk Sienkiewicz, want to get married because they are tired of the speculations they undertake. The fairy tales ends by the married couple living happily ever after. In the story of the arrivistes, he just turns into the arrivé, like the protagonist of Alcantara de Brown. Whereas the meaning of the marriage is emphasized in the plot, its accomplishment confirms the position and ends the novel as the social rising is completed. To conclude, family is an important issue for the novels of the arriviste career, both as a theme and as a construction of the plot. The noble heritage of its lack conditions the character's milieu and conducts, or not, to a marriage which is a sign of success. Essential at the beginning of the century, the meaning of the filiation diminishes in the second half of the 19th century, especially from the 1870s, when the money gains supremacy. Besides this change, the look at marriage does not evolve considerably, and it's still a confirmation of social position. In the story of Rastignac, we can see the complementarity of his both families. The first assures his entrance onto the world, the second one provides his success. This perfect combination is a model for other arrivistes. However, as the question of the birth is independent of us, the real chance for success comes to the arrivistes only when the name is not taken into consideration and the marital bonds are important. In this way, the perception of the family influences on the arrivists' careers, and the change in it at the end of the century enables more arrivistes to achieve their destination. Thank you for your attention.
But I realize I'm speaking about an invisible man, so maybe that's actually apropos not to have one. So, Jean Bory has identified the 19th century French bachelor by his invisibility in relationship to the world of families that reject him unrelentingly. Quote, "The bachelor, even though he's a wall gray and almost invisible, cannot lose himself in the crowd. Within him, there's a sharp awareness of his singularity. One would say that his being merges with his uniqueness, which suffers from not knowing how to express itself." Although he was seemingly happily married to Henriette for so many years, why did Jules Verne choose to highlight so many bachelors in his works rather than happy families? Although Phileas Fogg ultimately marries at the end of Around the World in 80 Days, the main thrust of the novel, like so many of his other ones, is on his bachelorhood, or on his relationship to his valet, Passepartout. And it is in his final novel, however, The Secret of Willem Storitz, in which an invisible, jilted suitor does his best to destroy the future marriage of a painter and his fiancée, that Verne's early antipathy for weddings and families comes to fruition in a Gothic, almost Poe-like tale. As Michel Perrault has remarked regarding the 19th century bachelor's pariah status among conventional families, the bachelor is, quote, "always a suspicious character, or one who is accused of something. He lives on the defensive as families cast an increasingly tighter net around him." Anne McVicar Grant, an 18th century Scottish poet, conceived of bachelors in terms of souls, quote, "passing in and out of society like silent ghosts, and seemingly to find themselves superior to the world." Similarly, Balzac has stated that, quote, "the state of bachelorhood is contrary to society," as he advocated for a special tax on bachelors that had in fact been adopted by the French Parliament in the 19th century. Following Balzac, Bory, and McVicar's ideas on bachelorhood, how could Storitz's invisibility be defined? If literally Storitz can be translated by storen, a parallel word in German that means to disturb, Willem Storitz places himself firmly on the margins of the established norms of his day, which Perrault understands as a place in which, quote, "bachelors, solitary types, vagabonds are marginal people who live on the periphery of a society in which the family is the absolute center. Their physical and moral existence is complicated." Willem Storitz, in keeping with general bachelor-phobic wariness in the 19th century, lives counter to society, but thanks to his scientific talents, enjoys not only a rebellious status in relationship to the citizens of Rags, the Hungarian village he torments, but a supernatural one that is punctuated by his fantastical appearances and disappearances. Storitz knows how to manipulate the villagers, who, according to Verne, are already predisposed to excessive superstition and susceptible to terror that any unknown phenomenon can provoke. Quote, "Legends filled with ghosts and phantoms, yarns about raising the devil, are quick to please them more than they ought. I know very well that the Ragsians are very Catholic, and that the practice of Catholicism contributes to this predisposition." Storitz, who cannot forgive the world for having thwarted what he perceived as his right to marry the sweet and beautiful Meyer Rodrich, constructs a space and a modus operandi that is in full opposition to Ragsian Catholic values in regards to family and marriage. Storitz succeeds in perturbing the village peace by breaking away from their values and sense of order in a manner that resembles Robur in Verne's Master of the World, who exploits his invented airship and the invisibility it gives him in the sky to terrorize those on the ground with makeshift bombs and aerial attacks on houses and homes. Storitz, of course, especially resembles Griffin, H.G. Wells' Invisible Man, in his monomania and his desire to establish a reign of terror on his village. Yet for Griffin, invisibility leads to a type of murderous rampage he is unable to control. Storitz unrelentingly tries to control both his space and the space of others to the point where he generates madness instead of succumbing to it. Despite being solitary in relationship to the conjugal life he so desires with Myra, he knows how to shatter the notion of private life in others by threatening to be simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, as his invisibility menaces everyone. His bachelor space invades previously happy family hearths, and his solitary feelings are spread thanks to an unbridled polyvalence. And I quote, "We felt safe in neither houses nor streets, neither at night nor in the day. The slightest sound in a room, the creaking of the floor, a blind shaken by the wind, a squeak from the weather vane on the roof, the buzzing of an insect in our ears, the whistling of the wind through a badly closed door or window, everything seemed suspicious. During the comings and goings of domestic life, at table during meals, in the evenings during get-togethers, at night during sleep, supposing that sleep were possible, we never knew whether some intruder were violating by his presence the inviolability of hearth and home. Whether this Wilhelm Storitz or someone else for that matter might not be here, spying on our actions, listening to our words, at last penetrating the most intimate of family secrets. Incapable of setting up a home himself, his objective is to destroy the domestic bliss of others, and especially Myra and Marc Vidal's. In this way, Storitz is emblematic of the classic 19th century French bachelor, the antithesis of couples, of bourgeois order, and consequently the sacred order of things. As Bourri has noted, quote, "Even though he is completely rejected by the world of families, he can't stop haunting it. It is poetic justice because it is constantly repeated that the bachelor is a creation from the family. Alone in his miserable apartment, he feels as though he is pestiferous, yet he's also the secret host, the invisible third party of families that spies on them beyond the partitions. He is beyond exiled, he is marginalized." If Myra or Mira in Spanish means look or watch, Storitz, by his theatrical efforts, becomes the most visible invisible man when he shatters Mark and Myra's religious wedding ceremony. He succeeds not only in penetrating the church, in freezing the religious union, but after having kidnapped the nuptial crown, a synecdoche of everything Storitz aspires to, at Myra's engagement party, he destroys the actual wedding by creating panic and horror. It was at that moment, Verne writes, that a cry rang out, a gut-wrenching cry, a cry of terror and horror. Storitz manages to seize the consecrated wafer of the Mass and shred it. Quote, "The consecrated wafer had been ripped from the old priest's fingers. The symbol of the Word incarnated had just been grabbed by a sacrilegious hand, and then torn to shreds, its pieces thrown across the choir. Faced with this profanation, the congregation succumbed in total panic." Storitz, like Milton Satan, wants to feel victorious in desecrating the consecration of marriage and profaning what the citizens of Hags hold sacred. It goes without saying that Storitz is considered the devil incarnate by the villagers. His diabolical image is overdetermined by the spatial eccentricity of his house on the Boulevard Téléqui, which the villagers eventually burned to the ground. Hags will see itself gripped by Storitz, whose supernatural theatrical stunts, such as the seizing of the nuptial crown and the wafer, that they can't help referring to him as, quote, the Antichrist, as he endeavors to demolish their sense of security and order. Moreover, the tower-like structure he lives in also contributes to his phantasmagorical image that resembles Dracula's eccentric but foreboding castle. Storitz's sinister bachelor space in fact fits into the bachelor chronotype identified by Jean-Pierre Bertrand, for example, who sees, quote, the tower surrounded by murky waters as reflecting a type of reverse romantic space instead of a romantic one. Storitz's tower is indeed closely linked to the fantastical, instead of the belvedere that the detective Stepark and Vidal uncover, hoping to find Storitz's body, but only leads to emptiness. No one, Stepark sighs in a cry that evokes one of Verne's famous solitary characters, Captain Nemo, whose name in Greek also signifies no one. I thought that this belvedere was for astronomical observations and that it kept instruments to observe the sky. Wrong. A table and a wooden chair, the only furniture here. That there are no instruments to see the stars is of course in keeping with the idea that Storitz can transform himself into a phantom. He is still alive, but he is bereft of poetic dreams. In this way he resembles Dracula also, as he sucks the lifeblood out of Rags and the Rogers family. Even though the crazed villagers burn his house to the ground, they are unable to find a corpse, since like Dracula, he belongs to the underworld. Their explosion of violence achieves only a temporary catharsis, as they are unable to extinguish his evil potential, as he kidnaps Mira and makes her invisible as well. This is why Storitz's space is condemned to a permanent rotting that resembles Dracula's declaration when he meets Jonathan Harker for the first time, and I quote, "A house cannot be made habitable in the day, and after all, how few days to make a century. I seek not gaiety or mirth, nor the bright voluptuousness of much sunshine and sparkling water, which please the young and gay." Storitz is too much of a destructive monomaniac to appreciate the sun as well, while Myra, although invisible in the end, is still luminescent because of her spiritual purity. Parallel to the translation of Dracul, or devil in Romanian, Storitz is Verne's invisible bachelor vampire, who rather than being destroyed by the cross, as in Stoker's tale, neutralizes the church's cross by disrupting the wedding and rendering Myra invisible to others, just as Dracula was able to control Renfield, then Lucy, by transforming them into vampires themselves. Dracula and Storitz take advantage of their malevolent powers to try to attain the other while being unattainable themselves. When Myra is returned to her family home, she retains her vivacity despite her invisibility. As Verne describes her space, it is of course the polar opposite of Storitz's, although it is physically the same. Both houses have belvederes, a tower, and a pavilion, but one is associated with death and putrefaction. Hers is filled with books and music, his with emptiness and silence. As Cécile Compère has demonstrated in her article Amiens sur le Danube, Verne is in fact describing the same townhouse twice, yet they are both facsimiles of Verne's own home on the rue Charles Dubois in Amiens. Comparing the Roderic's house to Verne's, Compère observes, "There is no doubt at all when you walk along the boulevard Longueville in Amiens. A familiar house emerges. The one Jules Verne lived in corresponds exactly to his description in Storitz. A tower, stained glass window on the corner of the house, drawing rooms able to hold 150 guests for a concert or a ball, as he describes in Myra's engagement party." Jean-Jules Verne, the author's grandson, noted that the description of the Roderich home seems to have been inspired by Verne's own recollections of his childhood house. Similarly, Claude Le Magnier also notes almost identical exterior descriptions of Storitz's house too, as Verne projected his own space onto two domestic structures that are apparently the direct opposite of each other, but still enveloped in a type of transparency that Compère explains in terms of a distorting mirror, the reverse of what it appears to be, the hidden figure, Verne codified and kept hidden what was dear to his heart and left the readers to discover his secrets for himself. But why would Verne have wanted to make contradictory representations of his own space in the same novel? Indeed, before he married Honorine, he found himself in a state of profound exasperation in regards to his own bachelor status. Every time he fell in love with a young woman, she inevitably married somebody else, and there was a bitter theme that ran through his early poetry. According to many of Verne's biographers, Verne had always been in love with his cousin, Caroline Tronçon, and was incredibly disappointed when she had to marry a wealthy but older man. After being crushed by his relationship with Caroline, he fell madly in love with Herminie Arnaud, Crostière, who became the subject of his most ardent love poems. When she too married someone who was even richer and older than he was, he continued to express his sense of betrayal and acrimony in many of the poems he wrote after their falling out. And according to Herbert Lotman, he had been dumbfounded by his love for Herminie. 20 years old, Jules remained under her spell, for he evoked her in poems long after her betrayal by betrothal. Betrayal by betrothal would make a good title, maybe, of this something. But I'll figure that out later. For Lotman, Verne began to despise bourgeois society in general, as well as the wealthy parents of the women he loved. And I quote, Jules saw himself as a victim, not only of the parents of the women, but, as he would often see himself throughout his life, the victim of bourgeois society itself. Moreover, when he began his career as a playwright, he belonged to a cynical and bawdy club called the Literary Bachelors, for whom he wrote the poem To the 11 Womanless Men. Could the violent rupture in Vidal and Myra's future conjugal happiness have been manifestations of a latent hatred Verne felt for the foundations of marriage itself? Could a desire for vengeance towards his early disappointments have been assuaged by the actions of an invisible avatar who succeeded in smashing the peace of a family that rejects him? For Gilles Carpentier, more than a misogynist, Verne was a misogamist. His hatred of marriages frequently appears in his early letters, and Jules Verne is split between a deep fear of and an intense desire for marriage. Once he was in fact married, Carpentier affirms, his happiness rapidly deteriorated into boredom. Life as a couple, I quote, irritated him. He deserts Honorine and his kids in order to devote himself entirely to his work, and he makes frequent visits to Paris to see his editor. In this way, the two extremes in Verne's attitudes towards marriage can be expressed in the two houses he describes in Storitz. The tranquility of the Rodrich family is invaded by Storitz, and Storitz's spiritual emptiness is scrutinized by Vidal and Stephark. Yet, between the two, another bachelor, who is more of an artist and less unpleasant than Storitz, haunts the novel in an ambiguous way. It is Marc Vidal's brother Henri, who in addition to being an engineer, becomes an author, as he is the one who narrates the novel. If Storitz, like Dracula, can be considered a man, quote, between two worlds, the living and the dead, Henri Vidal's name in French could be read in the same way, as it is in fact both vie, life, and dalle, a tombstone. Unconsciously jealous of his brother, he repeats Myra's name magically, mantically 3 times in reference to her beauty when he first arrives in Rags. She is charming, charming, charming. If her name can mean to look in Spanish, she can also imply the word mirage, as in the end, his brother will be the only one to be able to create a visible representation of her through a portrait he made. The rest remains in Vidal's imagination. Yet, at the ending of the novel states so clearly, appearances are only superficial, as it is the soul that transcends everything. Storitz is eventually killed in a duel with Stephark, but Myra lives in an invisible yet tangible conjugal harmony. Verne writes, quote, "It seemed as though we could see her gracious and smiling presence. She revealed herself through her words by pressing her hand. We always knew where she was and what she was doing. She was the soul of the house, invisible like a soul. That Storitz dies violently, if not phallically, with a sword in his hand, highlights the two opposite sides of Verne that were dueling it out to the death. Quote, "The two swords were clashing together, one held by a visible hand, and the other by an invisible one." Indeed, for 30 years, Verne was able to mask the pessimism he felt towards marriage and bourgeois society in general through the happy adventures of the extraordinary voyages that delighted young adults around the world at the time. The bachelors he portrayed, such as the proto-astronaut Michel Ardan or the dashing Phileas Fogg, were all relatively cheery and enduring characters known for transcending the limits of space and time. When his editor of so many years, Hetzel, died, however, Verne felt freer to release some of the bitterness that he had kept deep within him through his most grimmest later novels. And in keeping with the cliché, beware of appearances, Verne's last novel is astonishing for its unconscious playing out of the contradictions that plagued Verne since his youngest days as an author.
I want to thank everybody for your presentations. In this panel, we had an overview of gender politics. In a way, it was a pervasive theme in a way throughout all your presentations, and how certain characters challenge traditional views of marriage, and are also moving more or less in the margins of such conventions. So we still have some time now for questions, so I will open.
I would like to thank everybody for such interesting presentations. And I'd like to link I would like to thank everybody for very interesting presentations, and would like to link Sophie Gilmartin's this morning presentation with the presentation with the subject of Inês on at this panel. Actually, in what sense, and do you have the same feeling as I do, that actually even Nina Rolland presentation indirectly also actually refers to this topic? I have the impression that all these women in the 19th century novel have started exploring and searching for their spaces of liberty in a way. So they are making actually, they're paving a certain way, not of emancipation and independence, but, you know, like these certain little portions of choices that can be made, etc. So actually the question is for all the female presenters today, do you feel that actually Henry James, the portrait of a lady, is a certain kind of apotheosis of the hardness of these choices, actually, and of this difficulty that a female character expresses when she's actually faced with a certain liberty? Is it better for a woman to have a smaller portion of liberty and to live happy ever after, or to have a certain liberty and to have a lot of bad luck in a way? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, for my part, maybe I can begin, and then Nina, you could contribute your thoughts. I think you bring up a really interesting question, and it's one that I'm still battling with in my own work. I believe that Austen, just like many other writers of the 19th century, was working within this burgeoning new era that was working with the events that had happened at the latter end of the 18th century. Right, so we have the French Revolution with the publication of Letras, THELEME, du Citoyen. We have Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, which would, you know, call for a revolution in female manners and the way in which women, and I'll be paraphrasing here, labors herself to reform herself and the world. So I do believe Austen is working within that tradition, and other authors at that time as well. We have, to bring in Portuguese literary tradition, Camilo Castelo Branco's Amor de Perdição, where he also has female characters who defy the gentry family and the social strata in which they're, in which they're in. We have in that novel, we have two characters who actively defy patriarchal figures and their fathers, especially in order to chase the same common love interest. And they actually choose to die because they can't be with their love interest. And in that way, I believe, to answer your question about whether or not it's best for women to have little autonomy, but to have a happily ever after, it's all subjective and it's all dependent on the woman. But in this case, in the novel that I'm talking about, an extended autonomy leads them to a different kind of happily ever after. It leads them to death, which many people would consider the opposite of that happily ever after, right? But it's a death they're content with, and it's a death in which they die by adhering to their moral values and to the passions that guided them in life. So I hope that kind of answers your question. And maybe, Nina, do you have anything you could contribute to that?
Yeah, thank you for this question. And I think something that we all kind of said in this panel is that actually traditional gender roles that we think of in the 19th century are not that traditional and they are not that fixed. And Peter just showed it with the figure of the bachelor, where we would think that traditionally it's the unmarried woman who is marginalized and rejected. And it's so interesting to see that actually the bachelor is also someone invisible who also can be a monomaniac and who also can be someone marginalized and pathologized. So they are not that fixed anyway. But to come back to your question, should we give women in 19th century texts more freedom or less freedom? Because when they have freedom, like the adulterous women that I talked about, they kill themselves and they have a very unhappy ending. However, I think that these apparent unhappy endings of killing themselves is also pointing out at, well, their roles, their lives. It's not necessarily something that we can understand as a tragic ending or as a punishment. It's not necessarily a punishment. I think it's beyond that. It's really just pointing out women, the place, the role of women in the 19th century and their role. So I think it's more that rather than giving them more or less liberty. I think just it's interesting to see that it's exactly what is questioned in the 19th century.
I would like to add something. I think all this question is the question of what is the female liberty in 19th century, because I'm thinking about Gwendolen from Daniel Deronda of George Eliot, and well, then we can see that this is a young lady who, let's say, chooses to marry Grandcourt because she wants to preserve their social status, and she don't want to follow the material problems of their family, and she wants to protect their family, her mother, to going to the little cottage instead of staying in her house. So she chooses to marry for money, in fact. And she says, well, okay, the Grandcourt is the man which I can control and who will give me my liberty. But in fact, it's the other way around, and this marriage is sort of prison for her, and in fact, she has nothing to say in any of the situation in which she is participating. So I think that is really a question of what's mean a liberty for women in 19th century. And I would like to ask also a question. Jane Austen is rather focalizing on the happiness of ladies, but if I would like to ask if in her novels or in the other English novels you can see women who chooses to marry for rise up in the social ladder.
Well, there's always that, yeah. Definitely. It definitely happens. And as we saw in the keynote speech this morning, there's definitely incidents in British novels where women choose to marry, to rise themselves up, to climb that social strata, to bring themselves and their families up. And perhaps Professor Gilbert could talk more about that with you. Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it's something that I would definitely like to take a better look at, because I personally focus more on the women who choose to marry for love or for values other than the climbing of society, because I feel like that's more of a normative concept within 19th century family structures and values. And so it's not something that I've particularly looked into, but I would love to, and perhaps I could get your email afterward and we could discuss that. Not just within like British novels, but also within Portuguese novels and French novels.
It's just, even though I'm talking about a male, but your question and your paper reminded me of one Jules Verne novel that had a female protagonist who was, and she reminded so much of Austen in your paper, because she rejects suitors left and right, and she has like this desire for freedom. So she goes around, like her big quest is to go around Scotland looking for the green ray, this weird phenomenon, like sort of geographical phenomenon where when the sun sets, it has like this green ray apparently that you can catch maybe rarely, but it gives you clarity and insight onto marriage. That's what he projects it on. And so she rejects all these suitors until she finds the green ray. And he writes, just like you said, about the comfort of marriage and the goodness of the moral compass. Yeah. And that's what she's looking for. So, petit parentheses.
Yeah. Just one more question, please.
Oh, oops.
It's a very short question, so some other participants also can ask the question. Do you think that there is a difference between two French terms, célibataire, which means bachelor, and le vieux garçon, which means it's actually a female counterpart of the So I think that if we say a célibataire, it's someone who is not married, who is not yet married.
Right.
It's quite neutral. Whereas vieux garçon is a bit judgmental. I don't know how many.
Yeah, it's derogatory.
And in these terms, we can also think about male destiny in the 19th century, which is if we always focus on female destiny and say, well, she can be free, independent, not at all, or she can be semi-free, etc. In these terms, we can think of really some unfavorable life conditions of male characters as well.
Oh,
so
definitely.
Just could answer briefly.
Yeah, absolutely. So le vieux garçon is, as you say, pejorative, but it's also elucidates pity, I think. Whereas the célibataire, you have like various célibataires, right? You have the jeune célibataire, who's young and dashing bachelor, so he gets to choose. But then later in the 19th century, the ones that don't get married and they remain célibataire, they still use the word célibataire, but it becomes laden with all sorts of negative vocabulary. So there's the vieux garçon, who is like more pitiable, and then célibataire towards the later 19th century is disgusting. Like not as a value judgment, but as the words that are associated with it are negative, and or in the extreme case with Verne, like diabolical and marginalized, and like, what are you doing? Yeah. So.
Thank you. Following your question and your answers, I would like to ask if these 19th century women, could they have choices, considering the social, economical constraints they were living in? And if you look at women today, do you think women today are very different from you, for example, young academics, sitting here? do you have much more freedom and much more choice than those 19th century heroines? And Peter, talking about The Bachelor, were the social and economic constraints for The Bachelor in the 19th century novel, were they as important as for a feminine heroine, for instance? Yes.
Just for the comparison between 19th century and nowadays and the role of women, I think we can take George Sand as a good example because she had quite an independent life and she made choices for herself. So in this sense, I think she was a very modern woman. Although it's interesting because she didn't call herself a feminist and she didn't really want to be associated with feminist, the beginning of feminist, because it's a bit of an anachronism to say that for this time, but she didn't want to be associated with that. So I think she's a good example that there was a choice for women to be independent, live their lives, to write novels, to publish novels.
How many George Sands are there?
Yeah, not many, yeah. But she is probably not just the exception. If I take the example of music and of L'Adultera, the novel I talked about, so at the end, at the beginning of the novel, Melanie is married to a rich businessman in Berlin, and then she has a lover who is also rich to start with, but then he loses his job, and they both kind of end up in a more modest household than they had at the beginning, and she becomes a piano teacher, a music teacher. So, and she is actually the one who is working in the family. It's not her lover who's working. So through music, we can also see that women could actually work, they could teach, they could have a professional life. So there is, sort of choice and independence at that time, I don't know if you want to add something.
So I was thinking of your question, and so I think in 19th century, at least in France, French fiction, the Bachelor is relatively negative, but I think in the 20th century, it pivots to more romanticism. Not with a capital R, but detectives are célibataires, spies are célibataires, but like dashing ones, like James Bond, or and then in the the turn of the 20th century, everyone's isolated. Marriage as an institution, at least in America, crumbles, and so there's just a sense of isolation where everyone's célibataire in American fiction. So. I don't know if that helps.
Interesting. Yes. Thank you.
Is there
It wasn't, sorry, I'm not very good with these things. It wasn't so much a question as from the male perspective with it's Anna and Peter, isn't it? Peter's paper. I remember reading in Florence Nightingale's Cassandra, both from the point of view of women and men, how very difficult courtship can be, or even approaching a woman on the dance floor or at a party. And I was thinking, Anna, of you talking about the arrivistes' tactics in the marriage market, and any juxtapositions that might be interesting with Peter's bachelors, because a bachelor was, certainly in England, wives were, as they said in the etiquette books, to a penny. So when a man appeared on the scene, he was very much the centre of attention and being vied for, and there are a lot of tactics involved. But I would, and probably tactics for the bachelor to be careful about who he spoke to, because if he speaks or dances with a woman 3 times, they're expecting marriage, and it can, you've got kind of breach of promise sort of in the background there. So for both the Bachelor and the Arriviste, are there many comments on that, on women and mothers hanging out in the sidelines as matchmakers, or the conscious tactics tactics of the arriviste to get a good marriage, and of the bachelor either to avoid a marriage too soon or to at least try to make a choice that isn't forced upon him. That was, I'm not even sure that's a question.
No, it's
Observations. I'm interested in the tactics of both of them and what they have to guard against.
Well, for the arrivistes, of course, the marriage, as I said, is one of the most important things in their life. So they have really the tactics. One of them is to marry a daughter of their mistress. Is, well, the easiest one. And I was rather surprised because, in fact, it's rather a common tactic in 19th century. Yeah, but I think, well, I'm working also on the British arrivistes, but it's really different context. So I think we will talk about it later. But British arrivistes do not behave in the same way as the French ones. This is really clear. Another tactics. This is also a question. When we get back to the presentation which was talked here before, I think about Lucien de Rubempré, and he could be sort of woman character. It could be related with woman characters because he wants not to get married, and he just wants to follow the lady that he loves. And after all, we see that he do not succeed. So I think that the marriage, in fact, is something obvious in Arrivist's career, and the characters who want to be on the side and to act differently, they just cannot succeed.
Yeah, so I was thinking, like what you were saying is, you would add the adjective, the eligible bachelor, for that context, and then the families would get together, and the arranged marriages, and you have that a lot in historical fiction in the 19th century, or even like a Princesse Montpensier, where you have dynasties trying to make political marriages, and the suitors don't have much of a say in it. They can say no a few times, but not too many times. And then you have, and then with Verne, it's a complete rejection of that whole concept. That's why he sticks men in igloos or in submarines or spaceships. They're catapulted out of the structure completely. So there's like nobody there. And in the 20th century narratives, you have religious narratives, like Jewish or Catholic or Muslim, where the mothers have like, or the families have like a lot of control over marriages. But so that's my 2 cents.